So, let's take a look at New Zealand, which is particularly well known for being an incredible tourist destination. Susan will tell us more about New Zealand's active sport tourism and event strategy. But let's first have a quick look at Susan's career. Susan joined New Zealand's major events in 2017, the lead entity for events within central government in New Zealand. Her team acts as an advisor to government ministers on alignment events to government objectives, links the event sectors with the operational and leverage arms of government, invests in events to achieve outcomes that align with government priorities, and partners with other event stakeholders to attract, deliver, and leverage major events. Susan, now the floor is yours.
Kia ora, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. Wish me luck as I crack on here, and hopefully you won't lose me as we work our way through. Sorry, I'm just getting used to the auto cue in my hand. So we're talking about two different things here, right? We're talking about two paths, one which is driving tourism through sports events, either if you're a spectator or you're a participant, and the other is encouraging active tourism, which is people who come to participate in sport but aren't necessarily coming for an event. And obviously in New Zealand, we have both. My role generally in a ministry and looking after the fund that government has for major events has got at least a partial focus on driving tourism through sports events. Tourism New Zealand's got at least a partial focus on active tourism. So I've got some content from Tourism New Zealand to share with you as well. I've only got 10 minutes, so I will speed through that and we'll see how we go. So, next page is not working. There we go. We all know, because we are who we are, that events can achieve a lot of different things. This long list here is all linked with our major events fund investment criteria. Not all of them impact tourism, but some of them do. So if you think about that top one around net economic benefit to New Zealand, that nearly always comes through visitation. Brand New Zealand, that's telling our story to priority tourism markets. We can consciously set our events to fall within off-peak or shoulder tourism periods, so that helps to offset seasonality. We can support regional dispersal, so that spreads tourism benefit around New Zealand. And when we seek those tourism benefits through events, they are nearly always sports events. And we have hosted a lot of major sports events. And as you mentioned, we're quite well known internationally as a tourism destination, but also as a sporting event destination and host. And that picture there is just a couple of months ago at the America's Cup over summer. So if I go on to the next page, with luck. There we go. That long list of things that events can do for us wasn't particularly helping us prioritise, if I'm honest. So we focused with a statement of investment priority for our fund, and we didn't select sport tourism. What we selected was something that moved us away from prioritising immediate economic impact, which is usually visitation driven, as I said, to something that was more consciously about wider social and cultural benefits. So we still talk about internationally significant events. We still talk about, but instead of economic drivers, we talk about social connection, celebrating New Zealand culture, building national pride, those sorts of things. And importantly, for sports events, they have to pursue high performance outcomes, and they have to engage with youth and targeted populations, and particularly low participating communities. So for us, the most obvious way we're focusing on that at the moment is around women and girls in sport. So of that list there, and I threw choir games in just to keep you interested, we've got the FIFA Women's World Cup. We've got the Rugby World Cup in 22. That's the Women's Rugby World Cup. We've got the Women's Cricket World Cup also in 2022. They're all helping us to align with our aims of that targeted population, women and girls in sport. But absolutely, we are still measuring that longer list of benefits that I showed before. We are absolutely going to be focusing on driving international visitation and profile and amplifying that with Tourism New Zealand. Oh, reconnecting. So hopefully you can't see my next page yet. There we go. So that's the major events fund. If we talk about tourism through events, At the moment, because of COVID, we've got a $50 million regional events fund. It's consciously there to stimulate domestic tourism and travel between regions, but using the lever of hosting events. So it's essentially to replace some of the spending that's been lost from international students due to closed borders as a result of COVID-19. Did I say students? I meant tourists. Regions, of course, are very focused on events. Their benefit comes not just from international visitation, but also from domestic visitation. So a couple of those pictures there, that top right one is the Queenstown Marathon. Thousands of people travel from predominantly other parts of New Zealand and Australia to do that every year. The one below is a domestic rugby event in Auckland that was actually in June last year, with about 47,000 people or so in attendance. Oh, it turns out I've got a lock on my phone too quickly to be able to skip to the next images very fast, but sorry about that. And then, of course, there are events that are regionally supported that we don't invest in at all as government. So regions, of course, look for things like community and cultural connection, civic pride, vibrancy, but also with the intent of driving visitation, sport tourism. So every region tracks their visitor numbers, visitor nights, visitor spend. I'm sure they do in most cities around the world. This image here is actually an event called the Ames Games. It's an intermediate age sporting tournament. So in New Zealand, that's 11 and 12-year-old kids. 11,000 kids participate in this event every year, 24,000 unique attendees. They stay in a city called Tauranga, which has only got a population of 130,000. So that's a big influx. It generates something like 75,000 visitor nights for this small city. And I've talked mostly about local and central government, but obviously the private sector also has a real focus on sport tourism. It's such a core part of what it is to be a New Zealander and to visit New Zealand. But event organisers, of course, even in the private sector, need to be sure that their content's got enough appeal to make the numbers stack up. So they very consciously think about drive zone interest and fly zone interest. So the summary of that is it's not our sole focus, but New Zealand very much thinks about driving tourism through sports events nationally, regionally, and also in the private sector. So then as I crack on, you'll see a sudden shift in style. This has come from Tourism New Zealand. They're the ones that focus more on active tourism. This isn't new for us. People have been travelling to New Zealand for walks, for fishing, for skiing for 100 years. But what's probably changed is exactly how it is that we're targeting it. So this diagram here looks more confusing than it actually is, but it's this concept that we've got of active considerers in New Zealand. It's not possible to target everyone. So this funnel basically is a way to narrow your focus, narrow your audience pool. You start by your key markets, then you narrow it down by age, by spend, by the amount of interest that you've got in New Zealand. Then you take the absolute cream of that crop and you end up with 100 million people, active considerers around the world, people who are inclined, have got the financial ability, have got the interest in coming to New Zealand, and that is where we very specifically focus our interest. So here we go. So 92% of those active considerers, remembering who they are, they're interested in doing some sort of sport when we're here. We know that it's a real motivator for people to be interested in coming here. 31% of holiday visitors follow through on that. And just to explain, a holiday visitor is called that in contrast to being a business event visitor or visiting friends and relatives, which is a really high proportion of visitation to New Zealand. And then this shows what it is that the international visitors are interested in. Again, it's a real motivator to travel. The appeal of New Zealand for this sort of active tourism is clearly really high. And that's not a photoshopped image, by the way. That is some of the lakes in the South Island really are that colour. And then you crack on to what they actually do follow through and participate in. And I think this is pretty interesting too. I mean, this means 10% of our international visitors, 1 in 10, goes mountain climbing, rock climbing, abseiling or caving when they come to New Zealand, just as one example. So clearly that interest and participation from our international visitors for active tourism is really high. It's not just the international audience that it's important for, and we can't ignore domestic tourism as being a real foundation market I think, in any country that we're in. So active recharge is also very important to New Zealanders. You can see on there about a quarter of us are interested in hiking and walking and outdoor and adventure activities. It's the thing that motivates us even to move within our own country. And at the moment, particularly because the international borders are so tightly restricted, we've got a real focus on this even at home. This is some examples of it. We've got multi-day hikes around New Zealand called the Great Walks, multi-day cycle trails around New Zealand. All of those have really picked up interest domestically since we've had limited international visitation. And the opportunity for active tourism in New Zealand, to be honest, is, I forgot to change the picture. There you go. You're wondering what I'm talking about. There you go. The opportunity for active tourism in New Zealand is pretty much endless. So again, very brief summary. We do both. No longer is sport tourism through events necessarily the motivator for our initial investment, but we're certainly aware of and amplify visitation through sports events. And we're also very aware that a very large part of the appeal for New Zealand and the eventual activity that people undertake when they're here is active tourism, the chance to experience our environments and all the things that we have here. And I'll leave it for questions later.